So thank you all for sharing your evening with me. I'm going to share my screen. So I landed in this country about half a century ago as a 9-year-old immigrant from Shanghai, China. Within a month, I found myself in a 5th grade classroom in West Philadelphia, struggling to learn a new language and being teased mercilessly by my peers. But shortly, the same kids who were teasing me started to come to me for help with math. And that was when I realized that math had power, and the power of math transcends cultures. Now, my mother was a single parent, 4 kids. She was preoccupied with figuring out how to survive here in America. We know the downside of a single parent family, but the plus side was I learned if I stayed on the right side of the law and my grades were decent, she gave me plenty of time for free play. So I made all my decisions and I had to live with the consequences of all those decisions because I really had nobody else to blame. And it was on those streets of West Philly that I learned when a child has control over the learning process, they begin to take ownership. Once you take ownership, you want to do the best you can. And that habit of seeking excellence with a strong math foundation allowed me to graduate from the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in electrical engineering. I had a successful engineering entrepreneurial career, and by the time I was 36 years old, I had signed my first multi-million-dollar deal. I then decided I wanted to devote my life to helping kids build a solid foundation of mathematics. Now, Einstein said, you give me 20 days to solve a problem, I'm going to spend 19 days to first define the problem, because if you fully understand the problem, the solution pretty much naturally follows. And this is how we're trained as scientists and as engineers. So first question I asked when I started this journey was, okay, why is it so tough for kids to build a solid foundation in mathematics? And I realized that learning math is like learning any acquired skill. There are 2 parts. There's the knowing part. That's the conceptual understanding and the load that teachers carry to transmit that to children. But there's a second part, which is the doing, thinking mathematically, the practice piece where kids master and internalize the skill. That's the load that kids have to carry. Now, if kids don't practice math, that load gets transferred back to the schools, and that's why schools have such a hard time. So next question was, why don't kids like to practice math? They practice sports, practice music. In the realm of sports and music, we have the benefit of getting immediate feedback through our physical senses. Playing baseball, swing that bat, miss the ball, your eyes and ears will tell you, figure out next time I'm going to swing a little higher, still engaged, or ready for the next pitch. Shift over to the mental realm. Physical senses are useless, and unfortunately, we don't have a built-in feedback mechanism to tell you if you're doing math right or wrong. And for centuries, we've been essentially asking people to excel at this very important skill with a blindfold on. Now, technology has completely changed that ball game because instead of relying on another live body to serve that function, we can now rely on computers and servers. When you look at the amount of time spent for teaching versus practice in the realm of sports and music, practice piece is usually 5 to 10 times more the conceptual understanding for you to get good at the skill. And we're not duplicating this for our kids in math. Our kids are taught 45 minutes a day. If they were practicing 5 to 10 times, they'd be doing 6 hours of math every night. And you know that's not going on. In fact, if anything, it's the mirror opposite. A child does an hour's worth of homework, split among 4 or 5 subjects. Math gets 10, 15 minutes. That discrepancy is why it's been so difficult. So my focus has been on how do I get a child to take ownership, to enjoy thinking mathematically, and to put the time in that will allow them to get good at the skill. Teaching is certainly very important, but why try to win the race running on one leg? You get that child fully involved, it becomes a different ball game. Now, to put this in perspective, there's a quote which I love from the Asoro tribe, and it basically says, knowledge is only rumor until it lives in the bones. And the only way you're going to get knowledge in the bones is you got to practice it, screw it up, learn some more, and repeat. There's really no shortcut to this process. I created the 24 game and launched it back in 1988 as a way of offering children a lot of practice in a fun way. For those of you who may not be familiar with 24, It's a simple concept. You have cards that have 4 numbers on it, and the object is always to turn these 4 numbers into the number 24. You can use all 4 operations, use each number, but each number only once. And the cards are rated by difficulty. So the 1 dot, it's a little more obvious, like 2 times 4 is 8, plus 8 is 16, plus 8 gives you 24. You go into 2 dots, pattern's a little more obscure, 3 dots even more so. We have one combination that's ranked some of the most brilliant minds around. So it's a simple game, but it spans a wide range of challenge. Now, I saw how this card game, when kids spend a lot of time, it transforms their lives. One example is Cassetta Coleman. We used to run tournaments in numerous cities that were corporately sponsored. I saw Cassetta as a shy, reserved girl from Southwest Philly. She came to the tournament with dreams of going home with the grand trophy. And that first year, she won a bronze medal, which is really a consolation round. But Cassetta was not dejected. She looked me in the eye, and her parting words to me was, "I'm going to practice." Well, practice she did, came back 7th grade, citywide winner. Came back 8th grade, not only captured Philadelphia, went on to the state. That year, we started with 350,000 kids in Pennsylvania, boiled down to about 120 at the state capitol. With the governor, she emerges as the grand champion. She ends up going to girls' high school instead of a local high school, and 4 years later, she has a perfect 4.0 average, class valedictorian, receives $1.8 million in scholarship offer. What Cassetta accepted was a 6-year fully paid scholarship to MIT worth about $600,000. Now, I've heard hundreds of these types of stories. These tournaments involved education community. We had superintendents, we involved public officials, governors, senators, congressional members. We had letters going to the participants from 3 secretaries of education. We had a letter from George Bush Sr. that went to these kids. Tom Ridge served as the honorary chair in Pennsylvania. And of course, it generated a lot of excitement, a lot of press for the whole effort of math. We also got a lot of sports teams involved. So when the Redskins were the Super Bowl champs, they served as the honorary chair. We had the Chicago Bulls involved. We had a lot of media sponsors involved, TV stations leveraging PSSAs about math, importance of math. And these finals were held in sites of grandeur. So we were in the Franklin Institute, the Air Space Museum. Now you may say, well, how is it possible to build these kind of alliances? And I was able to do that basically based on 2 words. And those 2 words were mutual benefits. That was what I kept in mind constantly. A lot of people enter into partnerships, worrying, thinking most of their time about how am I going to benefit? Well, chances are the deal isn't going to get done. If the deal doesn't get done, you won't actually have the physical experience, because how you benefit evolves and changes. If your focus is always on mutual benefits, that mindset will actually give you a deeper understanding of how you yourself can benefit. So I kept that in mind. As a result, we were able to roll into numerous cities, Philadelphia, San Diego, in New York City. Charlie Rango was the honorary chair. These are the 4 semifinalists, and Joy Jordan was the overall grand champion. Cleveland, we had the Cavs involved. Chicago, Sarita Newman was one of the brightest kids I've ever seen. Played at the Fields Museum. In DC, Mildred came from an inner city DC school. This tournament involved all of the 4 surrounding counties, Montgomery County, Fairfax, and so forth, and she was the overall winner. Joe Gibbs was the coach of the Redskins, cut a PSSA that ran on Fox TV. Subsequent years, we had Senator John Glenn serve as honorary chair. The kids played under his space capsule that he took into space. In Africa, we had a national sponsorship by Old Mutual that touched about 1 million kids throughout the continent. Um, in Europe, we did a deal with Frito-Lay Europe, where they had tournaments in Thailand, the Netherlands, and they created a little disc that they called Flippos that kids could collect. And they had 24 games on there, and they distributed probably about 250 million of these through their various snacks and packages. And of course, the PR and press drove interest in all of this. In London, the mayor wanted to increase the numeracy skills of London youth, and we worked with the Mayor's Fund for London on a 24 tournament. At that time, Boris Johnson was the mayor. Of course, he's now the prime minister. Again, the grand champion that emerged was charity from a tough neighborhood in London. And interestingly enough, that at that time, Giuliani was visiting, and he was smart enough to decline playing against charity. The one in the middle was from BBC, and the stuff was aired and so forth. So these tournaments have transformed a lot of kids' lives. And in 2002, when the internet came along, I decided to create a digital platform because I wanted to broaden the reach and greatly expand the content. And so we stepped away from the tournaments. Since then, it's been taken over by school districts on their own. Every spring, you see all kinds of Twitter announcements about what schools are doing. Now, you may say, well, how was this possible that this guy took an idea and created all of this that occurred? And I'd like to share with you something that I learned about ideas, if I may. If you want to get in the chair business, what you need to do is to build a chair the best that you know how. That's what you take around. Don't take around an idea, because I could come to you with an idea for a great chair. I spend 45 minutes. The feedback I get from you is very different than if I brought you a chair, asked you to sit in it. Because you're going to say, well, this feels great, but it's hitting me kind of in the wrong place here. And that allows you to continue to refine that idea. The best you know how is the operative term here. As long as you apply that, you cannot fall back on any excuses. You can't say, I'm not ready to launch this idea because I don't have enough money. I don't have enough time. I'm low on energy. I don't have the connections I need. So as long as you apply the best you know how, you can always take a step to translate that idea into reality. Now, when an idea occurs, it appears as a point in space. We don't really know where these things come from, but they come. Most people have a sphere of influence, and they run around the sphere looking for someone, some organization that's going to take this idea and make it into a huge success. And generally what happens is they don't find that entity or person, and they get discouraged, and that idea then disappears back to where it comes from. If you actually manifest the idea into reality, you move that point ever so slightly. Now, the first thing I did with the 24 game is I made designs, I Xerox copied them, I laminated them, I hand cut a deck of cards, so that I took that first step of manifesting an idea into reality. A lot of people say, well, that little movement is so small. I have much bigger dreams of what I want to do. What they don't understand is that when you move that point, you also move your sphere of influence, and the arc out here is substantial. It's not visible to you right now, but it's there. So as long as you continue to move that point, you're going to be expanding greater and greater areas of influence that will ultimately translate that idea into the reality that you're seeking. Now, in 2002, I launched the First in Math platform. We now have over 200 digital games spanning from pre-K through middle school. And my goal of getting more involvement, more practice, certainly has succeeded. You look at, since schools closed due to the pandemic in March, kids have already solved 945 million math problems correctly on the site. Most of this was done from home. So this is really remote learning sort of at its best. We have a hub design, and behind each of these icons are lots of digital games grouped by skill levels. So I have a user-friendly experience. Now, the traditional way that people approach math is a linear model. The downside of this model is that doing math is an endpoint. You get there after you cross two big stumbling blocks. First, you got to convince yourself you can do it. If you're a little apprehensive, that's pretty scary. If you surmount that, there's another big roadblock waiting for you, which is you got to be highly motivated and want to do and put the time in. And most people get caught up in these two barriers, never get around to actually doing. And we know how that works because that's how New Year's resolutions work for us adults. We've always looked at this as a circular model where do is not an endpoint, but an entry point. So within 2-3 clicks, they're going to be in a game on First in Math, thinking mathematically. Every First in Math game starts off very simple. I found the quickest way to engage a child, give them something they can do. Because their attitude is, oh, I can do this. You immediately have their attention. However, if they're succeeding too easily, they quickly get bored. So engagement is a continuous process. I give you something easy to draw you in. I confirm quickly through what we call a short cycle of play. It may be a matter of seconds in some games because I've taken this range of skills and figured out how to chunk it in discrete steps. So you don't have to wait for minutes before you figure out how you're doing. And the minute you succeed, we then start introducing the rigor, but we're doing it on a gradient, so it always feels within reach. And because we start that way, the can do is not an issue. And because kids naturally want to master that next level of challenge that's within grasp, the want to do is not an issue. This model then begins a spiral of higher and higher math achievement. My experience is it's not motivation that creates action. It's actually acting immediately that motivates you to want to do more. So if you're in a period right now where you're procrastinating, you're looking for ways to get motivated to do what you want to do, the key is act. And that starts the whole process. Now, one game that will visually show you this approach is what we call the XYZ Shuffle. This game does not rely on numeracy skills. If a kid is weak, we can still draw him in, get him to think. The object of this game is to discover patterns, because patterns is really the language of mathematics. So we start with a bar. In the bar is a simple 2 repeating items, what we call an A-B pattern. There's a missing item here, Y. We're exposing children very early on to algebraic concepts that this is a variable you can assign a value to. You have 6 choices for Y. Child looks at this, everything is red or blue. I can likely forget the yellow star. Next line of thinking, I see the Y sitting between 2 blue hearts. What do I always see between 2 blue hearts? I see a red circle. Click it, matter of seconds, you're on to your next challenge. Here, it's a little bit more rigorous. Make a mistake, no problem. We give you absolute freedom to make mistakes on First in Math. There's no judgment, never penalty, points aren't taken away. We will give you feedback on what went wrong. We will give you another problem at the same challenge level. The minute you succeed, we're going to start pushing you again. So when we confirm that you've mastered a certain level of thinking, we now start introducing rigor. Now look what happens if a child continues down this path, gets to the end of this game. This is what they're trying to solve. 3 variables, both bars. This takes a fair amount of rigorous thinking, but a child won't get out here until the earlier foundations are built first, so they never feel frustrated. Now, one of the quotes that I love is from a Japanese educator. And he said, look, if you think you got a chance to catch the bus, that's when you make the effort to run for that bus. And that's a feeling we nurture in children on a daily basis. We're always stretching them so they're operating at the edge of their skills where the act of learning occurs, but they always feel like they have a chance to catch that bus, and that's why they make that push. That scaffolding that you saw within the game, we also carry through a series of games. One example is more or less. This is our kindergarten version. You have a numbers line, 0 on one side, 6s on the other. Balls were originally merged with just objects, no numbers. Wherever you click on the line, the ball's on a drop. So you see a ball with a quantity of 2 dots. Is it less than 3, more than 3? Place it properly. You advance, we start introducing numerals. You associate the number 3 with 3 dots. Then we start expanding the range, finish this game. We take you into our regular, more or less, or numerals. You'll move from single to double to triple digits. We have a decimal version of the game. We have a fractions version of the game. We even have an algebra version where we will give you an algebraic expression, tell you what the value of the variable is. You must compute this expression, decide where it falls on the numbers line. Now, algebra has been described as a gateway, and it certainly is, because it can either open doors or close doors for kids. You walk into a middle school, generally the percentage of kids who are comfortable and competent in algebra is pretty low. You would think this is an incredibly difficult subject that only brainiacs of the world can master. What's ironic is the concept behind algebra, that here's a variable x that I can assign a value to. This is a real easy concept for kids to grasp. We have kids in first grade, second grade, because it's really the concept of a joker when you're playing cards. Tell me what value you want the joker to be. That's it conceptually for algebra. The reason algebra is difficult is it's one of the first times they no longer look math in a narrow way. They have to look at math broadly, and they have to incorporate a half a dozen foundational skills listed here in red, all of which have to work together. So algebra is like an orchestra, can't have any weaknesses. Just like a child weak with fractions, didn't practice their violin, you stick that kid in an orchestra, you know what the results are going to be. So my goal with First in Math is to get children to master these foundational skills by them enjoying doing the practice. Once that's done, algebra takes on a completely different view. We get lots of reports from middle school teachers that what normally would take 4 weeks to teach quadratic equations, they can do in 3 or 4 days, because kids coming to them over multiple years had mastered these foundational skills. So the next question is, how do we do this in the most efficient way possible? Well, if you're interested in education, I highly encourage you, and if you haven't read it, the book called Talent Code by Daniel Coyle. Coyle was fascinated by why talent was blooming around the world that you would never expect, and he traveled there to see what was the common element. Give you one example. Tennis club in Russia, no money, one indoor court, yet they produce more top 20 world women's tennis players in the entire United States. The only thing he could find in common is all the participants were engaged in what he calls deep practice. And if you watch the child undergo deep practice, they're actually making a lot of mistakes. But the minute they make a mistake, they pause, they rewind, they do it again. And what they're really doing is building those neural circuits in their brains that will eventually allow them to master the skill. Now, as you know, everything starts with neurons in our brain. They fire off electrical signals. Those signals travel down nerve fibers, impact other neurons. But what the research shows is each time the signal travels down the nerve fiber, the body builds a sheath around that fiber out of a living tissue called myelin. More you fire, more layers are built. Now, why is this important? Well, imagine if you send an electrical signal down a bare wire. It's going to get diverted, lose its strength. The myelin acts like an insulation. And once that nerve fiber is insulated, the signal strength increases 10 times, the speed increases 100 times. So by undergoing deep practice, kids are essentially building the equivalent of a broadband network in their brain. They no longer have to operate at the old modem speeds. So Coyle talks about skills that may take you a couple of months to master. You might be able to do it in weeks, even in days, by using the deep practice technique. Just a quick story to tell you how deep practice can alter the course of history. In 1934, President Roosevelt was under a lot of pressure. And the pressure was Army Air Corps pilots were dying left and right. And it wasn't because they were involved in a war. This was before the war. They were just trying to deliver mail through winter storms, because in the early days, the aviation school, their technique was if you express an interest in flying, they take you up in the air, spend an hour, do loops and spins. If you didn't get sick, they say, okay, you got natural talent to be a pilot. Then they would they would give you 6 weeks of theoretical teaching about flying. Then they turn you loose on the controls of the plane. So the only time you had a chance to make those mistakes and myelinate those brain circuits was in a high-risk environment. The fatality rates of those early aviation schools was as high as 25%. Now, there was a fellow named Edward Link. He had an interest in flying. He went back to his father's factory, found billows, pumps. He built the Link trainer, what was essentially the first flight simulator. And as you know, if you've tried to be an entrepreneur and start a project, early goings are never easy. He built 50 of these things, and everybody thought it was a toy. 48 of them went to amusement parks. But the upshot is ultimately he persisted, and 10,000 link trainers were supplied to the Army Air Corps. And we trained 500,000 young men in a matter of years how to be competent pilots. And it had a great bearing on us being able to win World War II. Now, I tell you this story because my vision is to try to get First in Math to serve the equivalent of the link trainer in mathematics, where kids can come into an environment, build those neurocircuits in a low risk environment. When you're in over a long period of time, you can start to move the needle. We were in Philadelphia for more than a decade. Over a 9-year period, every single year, they had increases in percentage of students scoring proficient above on the state test. So I'm going to pause here before going in describing you to the next innovation that solves one of the biggest problems that educators and parents face about math. But I want to see if there are any questions, any comments anybody has. So feel free to unmute yourself and share what your thoughts are. Thorns in the side for parents and teachers is fact fluency, automaticity. I mean, this has been a thorn in our side for forever, really. So I spent 3 years ago, I spent a year and I looked at a lot of data. I looked at data for fluency. It turns out actually within fluency, the weakest link for a child is subtraction. It's kind of like the Achilles heel. And I wanted to know, why has this been so difficult? Now, one of the early concepts I learned as electrical engineer is the concept of signal to noise ratio. So if you have a signal that's not that strong, a lot of background noise, a lot of static, the experience is not that pleasant, and that's the way AM radio was. And I know most of you haven't even seen an AM radio, maybe except if you go into a museum. But FM radio came along, it boosted the signal, suppressed the noise, much better experience. Now with digital, noise isn't even a factor. So noise is what I focused on. Now here's an example of noise. Traditional 10 by 10 grid, 100 facts. We expect kids to memorize. However, it is only one operation addition, only deals with single digits up to 9. Add, subtraction, another 100 facts. Add, multiplication, division, 200 more facts. So in my days, we were required to memorize 400 facts to be fact fluent. Common Core has come along and said, well, we got to nudge kids into double digits. You add 10, 11, and 12. Now they've mushroomed from 400 to greater than 760 facts. And kids are too distracted. They just don't want to do it. This is where the drill and kill comes in, and negative attitudes about math comes in. And the reality is, a third of these facts, all this entire quadrant down here, sums greater than 10. There's no need for a child to memorize these facts. We can easily teach them mental strategies of how to group into tens, decompose numbers. So I can immediately reduce the noise by a third. I now teach children 3 simple rules that will further dramatically reduce the noise. 0 rule, real simple. Add 0 to a number, doesn't change, stays the same. Kid grasp that? I can eliminate 19 facts all adding by 0. Next rule, 1 rule. Add 1 to a number, next number is just what's on the numbers line. So I add 1 to 6, next number is 7. Grasp that, I can eliminate 17 more facts, all adding by 1s. I'm now down to 28 facts. And because addition follows the commutative property, there's a mirroring effect, because the result of 2 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 2. I don't really need to memorize both facts. What I've uncovered is that there's actually only 16 facts that a child needs to know from memory for both addition and subtraction. These are the very important facts. Absolutely no excuse for any child not to spend whatever time is needed to nail it, because once they do, now I got a solid core that I can count on and build upon. And if I do it in the proper order, we can take kids way beyond basic fact fluency. So VIF integrates instructional videos along with digital games. So there's a sequence line, can't jump out of sequence, little blue dots on the instructional videos. The minute the first concept is presented, the zero rule, there's going to be a game following. All the games are little red dots. The game will offer that child plenty of practice. Can't cheat your way through the game. Once they complete the game, we know they've mastered that concept. Only then does the next video open up. So with this strategic integration, I can control exactly what skills are being built in what order. So the minute I introduce a concept, I can be certain there's a solid foundation already mastered for that concept to stick to and for us to further grow out from. This approach allows us to go way beyond basic fact fluency. For instance, game 14 will be demonstrating your traditional measure, 100 facts, 3 seconds or less. We can actually take kids all the way to the end where they're dealing with any 2 double-digit numbers. If they were doing that strictly through memorization, they'd have to memorize 10,000 facts. So the VIF module starts by requiring a child only to memorize 16 facts. We will teach them all the mental strategies that will give them a skill that would be the equivalent of memorizing 10,000 facts. Now, the Bethlehem Area School District, when the principals saw this tool, decided we want our kids as third graders by the end of the year to master subtraction, this Achilles heel. And let's see how they did. There are 918 students in 16 elementary schools in third grade. 98.3% mastered the 64 foundational facts. Traditional measure of fact fluency, almost 95%. Jump out all the way to the end. Their goal was 70% for subtraction. They closed the year at 82.6%. Now here's the last game for the VIF subtraction module. You're subtracting 2 double-digit numbers. 23 minus 10, what's the answer? Well, the answer certainly isn't 45. The answer is in the circles because we've scrambled the answer. So the object is to match the answer to the problem. 23 minus 10 is 13. I look for my 13. Here it is. Click it, drag it up. That cell turns green. Move to the next problem. I'm going to be doing fine till I make the first mistake. The panel resets. I got to start over. So you can't just randomly guess and cheat your way through the game. Now, this is a skill most adults have trouble with. I was at a math conference in Austin, Texas, 200 math teachers. I put a double-digit subtraction problem up. 10 seconds later, I had 14 hands of people who solved it using mental math. And yet kids in Bethlehem, 82.6% of third graders had to solve not only 1, but 9 of these in a row sequentially without making a single mistake. VIF now has been created in all 4 operations. You look at the multiply, this is way beyond the 100 facts of the times table. They're multiplying 2 double-digit numbers. This game was introduced in April of that first pilot year with Bethlehem. And in the 5 weeks before schools closed, 545 elementary students completed this game because the foundation was built through the addition subtraction VIF module. We're now doing goal setting, intentional goal setting. One of the things is what we call the goals index to make sure that if kids only play the games they like, which is one sector, the most they're going to contribute is 25 points. We want also them to be fact fluent, another 25 points. We want them to have procedural fluency, learn to handle multi-step problems, open-ended problems, and then master solving word problems. So it focuses kids in 4 areas, and your goals index number is the center number right here. So these are the 24 games for procedural fluency. These are the word problems. We have deep pool, thousands of questions, giving them plenty of practice. Now, Marvine Elementary is a Title I school in Bethlehem. They have 96% on free reduced lunch, 92% are students of color. Before they learned about the goals index, they were last among the 16 elementary schools. And within 1 year, they became #1 among the 16 elementary schools on the goals index once they understood what it took and intentional goal setting. John Phillips is a 4th grade teacher, first in math anchor at Marvine. Once he understood how to move the goals index, he went back to his class and said, look, we're right now in the low 30s. I just showed you how to move this number in the middle here. Where do you think we could get by year end? The kids talked among themselves. 10 minutes later, they decided they could get to 90, which was a pretty ambitious goal. Well, it turned out they got to 100 a month before year end because the kids had taken ownership of the goal. It was their goal, and they were going to be sure they were going to achieve it. You look at the 3 classes in 4th grade, they all had high goals index. You look at the VIFs for 4th grade, 97.7 add, 93 for subtract, 75. could multiply two double-digit numbers. When the results came out, their fourth grade had a whopping 33% jump in percentage of kids scoring proficient above on the state test. Across all tested grades, Marvine had almost a 25% jump over a 2-year period. Lehigh University did a research study. It was peer-reviewed, published in the Mathematics Teaching Research Journal. Marvine subsequently received a Distinguished School Award from the Pennsylvania Department of Ed, and most recently, they won the National Blue Ribbon Award from the U.S. Department of Ed. Now, only 367 schools out of 100,000 schools in U.S. received this distinction, and it was because they were effective in closing that achievement gap. We have games now that get down into the K2 level. We've developed the whole computational thinking world where kids develop the ability to solve very complex problems. And we have just recently introduced this click and code that makes coding really easy and accessible for kids. Most of our games in the past were all drag and drop, easy to play, easy to get into. Of course, once you get into it, the challenge and thinking is there. I realized that with a drag and drop, you can solve these problems incrementally. By introducing coding, kids are now required to think all the way through to the end and not get confused. And that is a problem-solving skill that they need to develop. We have higher levels in the CT world that gets into, involving number sense of fractions, negative numbers, games that develop logic, reasoning. Some of these games you have to actually think 14 steps ahead, keep track of all your moves without getting confused. Now, here's my vision and goal, and what I hope my legacy is going to be when I finally leave this world. I want to help 100 million children become fearless in mathematics, because my view is when you hit that point, we reach what a lot of people refer to as the tipping point, where how math is perceived and mastered is going to be forever altered. Now, if I could play a role in doing that, I will feel that my life has been worth living. This little saying, nothing more satisfying than leaving one's fingerprints all over the future. And those of you who are interested in social entrepreneurship, I know there's a side of you that is going to be motivated by this factor. But I want to assure you that doing social good does not mean that you can't be financially successful. In fact, what I found is if you keep both in mind and you are financially successful, you'll have the strength to really make the broad impact that you want to do. So that's kind of my story that I wanted to tell you. And I think we have about 10 minutes left, which I'd like to open it up for questions. So.
Thank you, Bob, so much. That was fantastic. And I have so many questions, but I'm going to hand it over to the audience first. Maria.
That's just an applause. I
you were just
clapping. Okay. I don't have one right now. Yeah.
Oh, Shobha, you do.
I just want to say that this 24 math game sounds amazing, and this is the first time I've ever heard. I'm actually from Nepal and had a question about how can people in like South Asian countries get access to 24 maths games?
Well, probably the simplest thing would be through the First in Math, because it's digital. If you have a school in Nepal that's interested, you can email me and I will provide subscriptions for them so that they can try it. We can start seeding it in Nepal. By the way, as a quick story, I had a friend who actually did a lot of work, in Nepal. And when she first went there, she found herself in a kind of a community, that people were a little hesitant. She didn't speak the language. And she brought a 24 game because her kids were involved in tournaments. And she brought the game out. Within 5 minutes, everybody was involved, talking, because math is a universal language. So
that is amazing. Yeah, I'll definitely email you about this.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right. Anyone else?
Maha?
I'm a little curious about the testing phase of the game, since it involves kids and also like results take time to show? How did you go about testing the game and like its efficacy at the very beginning?
At the very beginning, I had the 24 games. So I had 10 years of just basically the card game. And the idea of getting kids excited about math, everybody, there's a lot of fear about math. And so the idea that I can get a child, excited to try math. And when you try to solve these cards, you realize there's a depth of thinking, mathematical thinking there that the simplicity of the game kind of belies. At the beginning, there wasn't as much emphasis on creating results for testing. I think that the whole No Child Left Behind has kind of really destroyed math education because it almost put too much emphasis on the idea of standardized testing. And I mean, if we can create results, that's great because the administrators, need that to get the funding they have and show that they're making progress and so forth. But my view is that, and I've looked at assessment data now, we have first grade kids, second grade kids that have completed all 4 VIF modules. They're dividing a 4-digit number by a double-digit number. This is a first grader. At the beginning, I used to think, well, are they really doing it themselves? And I talked to the teachers, and it turns out, yes, absolutely, they're doing it. These kids are really quite advanced, and with a site like First in Math, there's nothing really stop them. I have to produce results just to be able to encourage people to actually order First in Math for the kids. But if it was left to me, I would just allow them to go in and explore. I don't know if you're familiar with Sugata Mitra. He did this thing called the hole in the wall, where he went to India, buried a computer in a wall and just went away. Didn't tell them how it was used. It was connected to the internet. Came back a couple of months later, and these kids had taught themselves about DNA, the English language. And his always view was where there's curiosity and passion, learning occurs. And I think in some ways we kind of kill that with kids. So I don't know if that addressed your question about testing. We had the fortune of getting a grant from the U.S. Department of Ed. It was about a $400,000 grant that went to West Ed, which is a premier testing company that did a controlled study, showed there was a significant difference and so forth. So, but it's very expensive. And did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Anyone else? Brian?
Brian?
Yeah, so I had a question also sort of about like the beginning of 24 and like when you started to do these tournaments and whatnot, how did you initially find sponsors and like funding for these tournaments and whatnot? Did you find it difficult to do so in the beginning, or was it more like they're coming to you? Like, how did you navigate that?
Well, that was helped through the school districts. Actually, the person that put the bug in my ear about tournaments was the director of mathematics in the school district of Philadelphia. And because, my approach is always translate an idea, manifest into reality, I could go and have a deck that I could leave with him, have him play with it. He understood right away the kind of math thinking and he was the one that said, you ought to run tournaments. We've been doing this with this other product that's much more convoluted. And now at that time, they had programs which were sort of like partners in education, where school districts like Philadelphia, Chicago, had a designated person that went out and sought corporate people within the community to fund special projects. And the initial sponsors that I got actually came through them. In Chicago, which was one of the real early full city tournament that we did, that person found a bank in Chicago who, funded it and so forth. And this gets into how do you build alliances, how you build trust. And of course, once you start getting rolling, so this again is the key, is taking action, because that's what keeps the momentum going. So how we moved into getting government leaders involved was Fortune magazine ended up doing a story about our tournament in Chicago and the partnership in education. And one day I get a phone call from somebody who said, this is Rich Rollins. I'm with the Cleveland Cavaliers. And I was not a big sports fan. So I said, is this a sports team? He said, yes, it's basketball. I said, is this a professional team? And that's how we got the Cavs involved. I also got a call from the chief of staff for a congressman in Pennsylvania. And he became, Bill Klinger actually is sort of mid-state Pennsylvania. He became the first congressional member. And by focusing on mutual benefits, I realized that, education is something that's very important to parents. So if a congressman comes out and says, I'm putting a program together to get kids excited about math, you're immediately touching the hearts of his constituents. So these are some of the elements that allow this momentum to keep rolling. And of course, the minute you build that momentum, when you go to a senator, a governor, one of the first question is, okay, who is this guy? Are there ghosts in the closet that I got to worry about that's going to come back on me? But, you show that Charlie Rangel's been involved. Here's a letter from the president. Here's a letter from the secretary of education. It kind of mollifies all that, and the momentum then just keeps building.
Chris?
Yeah, you told us just an amazing story of many decades of continued innovation and expansion. How have you balanced? How have you thought about balance? What have you learned about balancing, moving into new products, moving into new markets, kind of building on your base? How do you think about all those different aspects of continued success?
Well, I've stayed in mathematics. We've had a lot of people come to us and say, oh my God, why don't you do something for me in reading or science and I've understood that when you focus in one area and put all your energy in that area, you have a chance to make some kind of an impact. I've also had a lot of people come to me and say, oh, we want to invest, venture people. And I've really shied away from all of that because I didn't want to turn over control of my vision to, a corporate group whose priorities are different than mine. So I've been able to build this business really, sort of bootstrap from the beginning, and I don't have to answer to anybody else. But I'm running into what we all going to run into, which is time. At some point, I'm going to run out of time. And so, and I'll just tell you a quick story about when you take ownership. When you take ownership, you become very persistent. So when I was young and in the streets of West Philly, Kennedy was the president, going up to space was the big thing. I decided I wanted to build a rocket. And the only thing I could find that was similar to sort of powder or ignition force was match heads. So I would go and collect bottles and turn them into a supermarket, get the money, and I'd buy these box matches and I would clip the head off with a little nail clipper. I found myself a tube. It was about 2 inches in diameter, about 2 foot long. And it took me forever to fill that tube. But I only persisted because it was my idea. I had a vision and I was curious to see what was going to happen when it was executed. And I think that's the key. If you're going to go into this thing, you got to own it. And if you own it, you're going to be persistent. And if you keep at it, keep taking action, it's going to manifest the reality. I mean,
Did it work?
well, it didn't move at all. What I ended up doing was creating the largest smoke bomb in the neighborhood. Of course, you couldn't do that these days without getting in trouble with the law. But back in the late 60s, it was a different kind of scenario. So,
Bob, I have one more question if you'll give us one more minute.
Sure.
What you've touched on here aligns with so many of the ideas that we've had in our readings and class discussions. And I know the students are right there with me that you've described so many of the processes that we've read about theoretically, and now you've applied in a real business success. one of the concepts we've been talking about is reframing failure as learning, right? And when you try something and it doesn't work, how do you learn from that and you move on? And my knowledge of Math 24 is it's a big success, but I'm sure along the way somewhere something didn't work out. And I was thinking in my mind, I don't know how you got to the number 24, but maybe 23 didn't work out and 24 made a better game. And I won't make you divulge all that, but are there stories like that that the class could take away and of failures you learned from along the way? Not failures, but challenges.
Well, you're always going to have challenges. If you try to do anything that has some scale or consistency, you're going to run into challenges. I mean, I learned that early on when I came into to the States on the streets of Philly. But, you know, to me, making mistakes, I see it as an opportunity to build those neural circuits, because if you want to master anything, you have to get those neurons to fire together in a particular pattern. And we don't know what neurons are required. I mean, the only way to figure that out is to keep trying. And when you make a mistake, it says to me that this particular cluster of neurons that I'm trying to pull together isn't quite right. Now, if you stop, then they're going to lose and eventually it'll peter away. But if you make another effort based on what you've learned, you've actually extended that. So, you know, I mentioned about the importance of practice. By approaching it in lots of different ways and different angles, you essentially have repetition without repetition. So you build that kind of flexibility that allows you to deal with difficulties. And so, I mean, being passionate about something that you want to do is going to be crucial. And I would think that if you guys are taking a social entrepreneurial course, you know, part of that is already there. And any setbacks that you have, any losses, I don't know if you've lost a close family member, which I have, that kind of emotional experience can actually serve as fuel for driving you to a bigger vision. And instead of kind of having it push you down. So one other quick story I want to tell is that when we did these tournaments, and I did this for 10 years, the largest percentage of grand champions at the end, you start with over 100,000 kids, you're down to one kid. The largest percentage of these grand champions turned out to be Black girls. And I realized after watching them that when you're playing at that level, the mathematics is a given. That's not the issue. But somehow African-American girls had that intense focus. So they're there, the governor's there, there's 3 TV cameras. They absolutely do not lose concentration of what they're trying to do. And that sort of inner steely core that allows them to just stay on it was what distinguished them as a grand champion. And I found that, you know, because I consider myself as an urban kid, when you live in that kind of environment and we know all the difficulties that occur there, it actually, I find many kids they have a burning desire to prove themselves, and they just basically need a vehicle within which to do that. The minute they have that taste of success, they know they can do it, and then they can apply it to bigger and bigger scope and areas. So Stephen, I see you brought your son.
Bob, quick question for
Yeah.
you. So you talked about taking ownership, right? That's the key. Now, obviously, in your situation, you've experienced some adversity growing up in the streets of Philly. You talked about, you know, just in general, kind of what that environment breeds in a person, kind of that resiliency. But what's your advice? Because every parent I know that I talk to laments that there's just no ownership and kind of commitment in our kids as much as we're pushing them. So kind of what is your advice when you go into these school districts?
So one of the strengths that First in Math has is that kids take ownership. My view is if a child doesn't take ownership, it's always going to feel like pulling teeth on your part. And I've learned that if you want a child to take ownership, you must relinquish control to them. If you're always going to be telling them what you want them to do, it's your thing, it's never their thing. And so First in Math was actually designed where a child comes in and they make decisions about where they want to go. They try a game, it's too easy, they move to something else. It's too tough, they move to something else. At some point, they're going to zero in on a game that's just right, that suits their skill level. The minute they succeed, we're going to start pushing them so they're not going to get bored because the challenge is there. But by allowing that child, and when I first launched First in Math, it was difficult because schools aren't used to allowing that kind of control for children. You know, they want to establish what the weaknesses are, create a path, and make sure that they stay on grade and deal with the subjects that they have to teach. But if a child is not engaged and involved, all those attempts to do that is not really sticking. So the key is relinquishing control. You know, have faith in that child, let them explore. I mean, even if it's for 3 weeks, and the minute they become engaged, now you can start steering them kind of in the direction you want.
I know what I'm telling my 7th grader. We have a login. We have a login from you already. We're going to get back to the daily practice every day. This has been really fantastic. And I know that the students and I are going to be debriefing, and I don't want to overstay your welcome, but thank you so much for.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing the evening with me, and thank you for inviting me.
Truly excellent presentation.
I wish you the best. I know many of you are going to make an impact. So you're young, you're full of life, and you know about possibilities of what can occur in your life. And I know you're going to do it. So thank you all.
I'll tell you, this is a smart, engaged bunch. You'll see them. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. All right, for the class, we have a working session that we're going to do after this. So let's take a few minutes and let everybody take a break, and we can regroup here in, let's say, 8:20. Does that sound good? And then we're going to hop into Teams, and we can debrief a little bit. Before we go, does anybody have anything else they want to say about that presentation that you didn't want to ask him? Or I really want to know why 24. That's what I'm